Hi, my name is Aditi Ganeshan, and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the research presentations for the 2021-2022 cohort of the Meta India Tech Scholars. Meta launched the program to provide a research and mentorship platform to law students who are keen to engage on contemporary questions of technology, law, and policy. The law firm Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas Co is supporting the program as a knowledge partner. Through this series, the scholars will show us how specific policy choices in the technology sector influence and impact India's tryst with the internet. Today, we have Karthik Rai with us. Karthik is a student in his final year at the National Law School of India, University, Bengaluru. He has pursued his interest in tech policy, which stems from the prospect of interpreting laws to adapt to changing technologies and regulating a dynamic niche. Through his courses, internships, and publications, he has undertaken research on issues pertaining to data governance and platform regulation, among many others. He plans to further pursue his interest in this space after graduation, along with exploring other areas of law as well. I'm delighted to have you here, Karthik, and I look forward to hearing more about your research on interoperability paradigms in India.
Thank you so much, Aarti. Let me just share the screen so that the slides are visible. Yeah, just to confirm, are the slides visible?
Yes.
All right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Karthik, and the topic that I had chosen for my paper was social media interoperability in India. So just before we begin the presentation, I'd just like all of you to imagine a situation where you as a social media user are aware of the disastrous consequences that were brought about by the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which showed how a social media platform was collecting data without consent and was violating a lot of user privacy. Now then, having been aware of this situation, you, let's say, log into a social media platform and you find that they have changed their privacy policy to make it very much exploitative, in that, let's say, they collect a lot of personal information without a lot of consent, and then they sell it to third-party marketers, etc. Now, once you realize that, you perhaps may want to feel like switching to another social media platform, but you actually cannot do that because a lot of your friends and a lot of your existing information is on that social media platform. So what do you do at that point? This is an example of some exploitative practices that big tech firms have often undertaken by violating your privacy because they know that you can't switch to another platform. And therefore, to regulate these, a lot of suggestions have been proposed by governments to sort of bring about this concept of data liquidity. What I mean by data liquidity is the ability of data to flow from one place to another so that you can sort of control where the data moves and therefore gain better privacy control on your data. So one such initiative of data liquidity has been this concept of interoperability, but it's relatively not that well explored. And that is what I seek to do through this paper. Now, why I chose this topic was it's about how revolutionary this concept is in the context of social media, which is something that directly affects us and we directly interact with. Apart from that, I've also been really interested in issues relating to governance of social media platforms. And that is why I thought that this topic would be a perfect blend of various issues that you would have to counter when implementing a law on interoperability. Now, having said that, I'd like to state a caveat, which is that the analysis in this paper has been user-centric in the sense that it's been focused on empowering the user as against being, let's say, platform-centric. So having said that, let's just proceed with the first part, which is how interoperability works. So before understanding how interoperability works, we need to know what portability is, because that's interoperability is an advanced form of that. So in the previous iterations of the Data Protection Bill of India, the government guaranteed a right to data portability, which basically meant that a user of a particular platform, for example, could download their personal data in a machine readable format and port it or transfer it to another platform. So why this was given in the law was that you could, let's say, if you were dissatisfied with the services being provided by a particular platform, you could take your data from that platform, move to another social media platform, and basically start, using that account in that other new platform. So how this would be relevant for privacy is that it gave you control over where your data existed, which basically meant that you have determination over your information and helped you reduce the switching costs of moving from one platform to another. This was considered to be powerful in tackling network effects, which is the ability of social media platforms to sort of, keep you in this closed ecosystem where you cannot escape them. So by providing portability, it was sought to tackle this problem of network effects. However, through this paper, I argue that portability in itself is not a very strong method to sort of guarantee greater user agency, because it does not fully address the network effects, because data portability is a one-time measure, which is that you make a request to a platform and then they give your data and then you port it to another platform. What's the problem in this? It basically means that your existing connections or followers still remain on that old platform and you cannot interact with them because you shifted to this new platform. So it did not fully address this problem of network effects, and this meant that users will still have to stay back in their old platform because they have a lot of their followers and a lot of their other things that stay on that platform. It is in this context that interoperability becomes a more advanced solution to guarantee user privacy and agency. Now, what exactly do I mean by interoperability? So I borrow from Cory Doctorow's conception of interoperability, which has two prongs. So one would be a real-time data portability prong, which is that data is transferred from one platform to another real-time and not based on an individual user's request each time. And the second prong would be a back-end interoperability, where different social media platforms are able to actually communicate with each other real-time, which basically means that if you exist on one platform, you can communicate with the users of another platform. How would this look in real life? So I have a picture which sort of depicts how an interoperable social media platform might look. So for example, if you see in this picture, you have several sort of accounts of Facebook, Instagram, and other social media platforms sort of linked together in a single interface, where if, let's say, you post an image through one platform, you can comment through one platform, you can also comment through another platform, and you can like it through a third platform. So basically, it means that even if I move to another platform, I can still access my friends and followers and the information or content that they post in that old platform that I was in, which basically is more effective, therefore, in countering the problem of network effects. Because earlier the problem was if I shifted to a new platform, I would not be able to contact my followers. But with interoperability, that problem goes away because the transfer is real time and you can still interact with your followers. And therefore, network effects is very strongly tackled. Now, how in this paper I argue this achieves privacy is because it provides this concept of structural privacy. So what I mean by that is that I argue that the structure of the internet or the structure of social media shapes the user's expectations of privacy. Now, in existing conceptions of social media, they're walled gardens. They're separated from each other, and you can't access one social media platform from another. That basically means that if a platform imposes some privacy violating practices, you're forced to stay there. You can't move to another platform. But by tweaking the structure of the social media platform through measures like interoperability, you're opening up the structure of this social media platforms to become more open and to break down those barriers between platforms, basically allowing users to switch easily from one platform to another. So basically, platforms will then be sort of forced to provide you better services, better quality of services in the form of better privacy. And therefore, it'll be a competition for better quality of services and you can move from one platform to another. So it becomes evident how when you change the structure of the internet or social media platforms in this case, through interoperability, you have better user privacy and agency guaranteed. Now, so given that this is such an important concept, it becomes important to understand how regulation in this context would work. So there have been in the past, in India at least, initiatives to sort of guarantee movement of data, which is data liquidity, like I mentioned earlier. So like I said, in the earlier iterations of the data protection bill, there was the concept of data portability. And there were also certain reports on non-personal data, which overall, if you look at the analysis, or if you look at the opinion in both these legislations and committee reports, you will find that the intent of the government has been towards the side of transferring more data in the interests of user agency. However, what has happened in doing this or in suggesting this has been that these considerations of who actually owns the data, what kind of commercial considerations exist in the data that's being transferred from one place to another, that has sort of remained unsolved because there exists a lot of intellectual property that can exist in a particular piece of information or data, and that has not been sufficiently addressed by the government. So this problem arises because if you look at data protection and let's say competition, they look at promoting innovation and securing user agency through using one means of innovation, which is that they're sort of guaranteeing access to all market players. But if you look at IP, it's about incentivizing innovation by sort of giving this exclusive right to a particular user or a particular social media platform in this context. So they promote sort of innovation, but they have different perspectives to do that. And therefore, in the context of interoperability or data movement of data, these goals clash with each other, and therefore they have to be reconciled. And that is what I seek to do through the rest of the paper. Now, if you look at the two components which I mentioned, which interoperability requires, one of them is, like I mentioned, is the backend interoperability prong. What it essentially means is that different platforms communicate with each other to transfer data between platforms. Now, for this, you need something called an application programming interface or an API. And what does an API mean? It's basically a software which enables access to an underlying data or functions. And this basically helps two programs or two social media platforms to basically communicate with each other. Now, what happens is that in the case of interoperability, you need these API to communicate with each other. And in doing so, they have to exchange some information. And therefore, a platform might argue that this exchanging of information might violate our rights to IP because the API itself has certain intellectual property in it, which cannot be divulged. So in this context, I look at the copyrightability of APIs. Now, the Copyright Act seems to provide for copyrightability of application programming interfaces. But then I look at cases from different jurisdictions in the world on the issue of copyrightability of APIs, because India has not specifically dealt with it. And if you look at the decision of the European Union, they basically seem to go against API's copyrightability because they say that if you copyright the API, it would mean copyrighting the underlying idea, and that's not possible in IP law. On the other hand, in US, in the Oracle decision, they did assume that APIs are copyrightable, but then they said that the use of API information is fair use, which is an exception to copyright. Now, these sort of look at two different aspects, and I try and reconcile them through the Indian decision of Mattel versus Jayant Agarwala, where the courts applied the merger doctrine and basically said that if an expression of an idea does not monopolize this underlying idea, that expression can be copyrighted. So through this, I say that if as long as the API does not monopolize this underlying data, it can be copyrighted, and therefore you'll probably have to look at now if the APIs have to share information now, you'll have to look at whether there's an exception to copyright, and that exists in the form of a fair dealing exception. So in the Indian Copyright Act, there is an exception where if you do any act to obtain information to promote interoperability, that will be an exception to copyright. Therefore, I conclude in this section that if the government through a law imposes a requirement of APIs to communicate with each other, it will violate copyright, but it will still be under the exception of fair dealing, and therefore it will be a valid sort of measure to take by the government. The second part of this interoperability prong was the real-time portability prong, where the data would be exchanged real-time between one platform and the other. In this, there are two broad sections which I look at. One is the concept of trade secrets, which applies to data which is unstructured. So trade secrets protects commercially valuable information which is not publicly available, and therefore will protect individual bits of information which are inferred or which is commercially valuable to a particular platform. So if it has generated inferred data on me as a user, that will be protected under trade secrets. However, this law is not very effective in protecting ultimately the commercial interests of social media platforms, because there are certain categories of data which by themselves may not be secretive and therefore might not be protected by trade secrets, but when they're combined together, they generate inputs which can be commercially valuable for that platform. But these categories of information are not protected under trade secrets law. Now, if you look at copyright, while trade secrets law protects individual bits of information, copyright protects data sets or compilations of data. And for the copyrightability of data sets, the Indian courts have established this judicial standard of a minimum degree of creativity accompanied by skill, a certain exercise of skill. So if you have this element, you can copyright a particular piece of information or data set in this context. So there might be a lot of data sets which include inferences that the algorithms of social media platforms generate. So these data sets can be protected under copyright because there is an exercise of skill and there is creativity in that algorithm being deployed. On the other hand, there are certain data sets which might not pass this threshold. For example, data sets that are provided solely by us as users to that platform, or data that's just collected from us by the platform. So these kind of data sets might not have a significant degree of original element or a creativity element to it, and therefore might not be copyrighted. So, and this sort of analysis was prevalent in the government's analysis in its report on non-personal data, where it said that certain categories of non-personal data can have to be mandatorily shared. So basically, the conclusion that I draw from this point, from this analysis, is that the law on IP protects certain categories of data, but it lets certain categories of data pass by from its protective ambit. And this might really disincentivize platforms, while they might have put a lot of commercial sort of resources in securing the data from the user, which is not rewarded if the law is applied like this. And therefore, there becomes a need to relook the regime on copyright if we are to bring about an interoperability mandate in India. So for that, in the last section of the paper looks at certain recommendations from my end and certain considerations subsequently. So on the recommendations part, primarily on the intellectual property part of it, I suggest a mellowed down interoperability mandate, which basically means that there are these data sets which have to be shared by platforms with other platforms in the interest of the public, because like I said, interoperability guarantees user privacy. So there has to be imposed a licensing regime for platforms to share data sets with other platforms so that this concept of real-time data portability is achieved. Now, like I mentioned in the previous slide, there are certain categories of data or data sets which might not be protected under existing IP laws, but then they still involve the commercial efforts of individual platforms. So if you just ask them to share it for free, it might be really discouraging social media platforms to undertake business in India. And therefore, this concept of a sui generis data right has to be provided to these platforms, which basically means that even if there are certain categories of data that are not protected by copyright or trade secrets, they will be protected under this regime. And therefore, even if a law requires the sharing of such unprotected data sets, by virtue of the sui generis protection, those will also have to require a remuneration to the platform sharing that data. Now, how this would work, in my opinion, would be a multi-tiered licensing regime, where, let's say, if the information is completely unoriginal or it's just based on collection of information from the user, that can be shared at an extremely or a relatively low cost. While if the data or data sets contain partly collected information, partly inferred information, you can provide higher compensation for that. And if a data set contains completely inferred information, that's the commercial property of that particular platform. And I argue that you should not impose a mandate to share such inferred data sets with another platform, because that will hinder the functioning of social media platforms in India. But while these suggestions have been proposed, I admit that there are a lot of considerations to factor in when implementing such an interoperability law in India. So one would be the very concept of privacy. Like I mentioned, interoperability is important in guaranteeing user privacy, but at the same time, by guaranteeing interoperability, you might open up a Pandora's box of more privacy violations, because if not implemented properly, because if you have multiple social media platforms exchanging data, a single point of vulnerability might be enough for a hacker to steal information and conduct, let's say, impersonate some user based on their information and cause a lot of other violations of laws. Therefore, this privacy angle has to be tackled by using proper standards to guarantee interoperability. The other point is of technical feasibility. So you have a lot of social media platforms with different features. For example, a Twitter might have a retweet button, a Facebook might not. So when these platforms are communicating with each other, will a retweet work on Twitter? Will it be seen on Facebook? How exactly will that communication work? That has to be figured out. Another issue would be, what if I, as an individual user, don't want this interoperable platform? I just want to stay on one platform. How would that work out if, let's say, I have a joint set of information with someone else? Let's say I have a photo with someone else. That person wants to move to another platform, but I don't want to. So all of these considerations, how will data then be transferred when one person is agreeing and the other person is not? So there's this concept of linked data, and how exactly this would play out if, in case interoperability is imposed through a law. That becomes something to ponder about. The last thing is a political fact angle to it, which basically means that if social media becomes interoperable, it becomes much more decentralized. And by decentralization, the government basically has lesser control over each individual social platform. And in this era, when you have a lot of regulations on intermediary liability, how would it work when, let's say, you're imposing liability on one platform, but the same information is available in another platform due to the concept of interoperability? So that becomes something to wonder about. So basically, through this paper, the argument has been that while interoperability is definitely an improved solution in guaranteeing the free movement of data and thereby securing data privacy for individual users of platforms, it still has certain considerations that the government must not run roughshod over. It must factor in these considerations, which include IP related considerations and concerns of privacy, technical feasibility, and political factors. And by looking at these, perhaps we can further the debate of interoperability in India. So that has been my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karthik. That was really fascinating. And I think definitely a part of tech policy that's rarely explained very clearly. It's like the words interoperability are thrown around, especially maybe in the context of telecom. But when you're looking at it from this kind of internet-based perspective, it's not particularly explained all the time. So this was really helpful to just understand those building blocks. One thing that I noticed, and I know we've discussed this before, is you've clearly highlighted that this is a user-centric approach. You're looking at how this can benefit users. But the entire time I'm watching this and just thinking, why would a platform be incentivized to do any of this? Because the whole point is you have this walled garden, as you mentioned, that people only find the services that you provide in your walled garden. So, I mean, why would platforms be incentivized to do this as opposed to other things? Is the environment so hostile, or for lack of a better word at this point, that this is the best option? Or is there actually like a tangible platform incentive for, implementing interoperability mandates?
You're absolutely right, Arti, because like you said, if when I look at this analysis, it's a lot of how platforms might be disincentivized from this if an interoperability mandate is imposed in India. But this suggestion of imposing interoperability is in a larger context, I argue, because if you look at suggestions of regulating big tech companies, especially social media platforms around the world, the suggestions have been much more radical. So, and most of the debate has been going on in the EU and the US. So you have suggestions as radical as breaking down big tech, and then undoing their acquisition. So a lot of these regulations or suggestions to regulate platforms have been much more radical. And in my opinion, an interoperability mandate would be much less radical. Like I mentioned in the paper and the slides, it's a much more mellowed down solution when compared to other radical solutions. And therefore, I feel that it will be a more palatable sort of solution to platforms as well. Because if you sort of pay attention to their IP considerations and try and incorporate them within this framework, it'll be something that will be a less bitter pill to swallow for these platforms. Having said that, like you said, my objective has primarily been to look at how it can be more user-centric. But then still, this I suggest would be a better solution than other existing ones.
I mean, it's interesting because we've also had other scholars presenting about antitrust and data sharing, and many of those concerns that you raised, even in the context of this, are raised there as well. So it really makes you wonder what the ideal kind of antitrust solution is in this environment, because everyone is concerned about everything. So I guess this is just one of the ones that platforms may have to deal with in the future. And you had mentioned sort of loosening or mellowing the interoperability mandate, and that can be done through a regulatory apparatus. And I was just wondering what you think that apparatus might look like. And I'm asking this in the context of, especially in India, our laws have famously been siloed into different things. So you have a telecom law, you have an IT Act. Everything is sort of quite, specific to a specific sector, and that helps in certain ways. But in this case, it's a very careful balance of IP and also privacy and also platform regulation. So how do you envision a law like this being formed? Is this going to be, in your opinion, something that should ideally be done as subsidiary rules to, say, a Copyright Act or an IT Act? Or does it require separate legislation that takes into account these kind of different sectoral things and combines it together? So how do you sort of view this happening?
So I view it in terms of the latter, which you suggested, which is a separate law and not a set of rules under a particular legislation, for at least a couple of reasons. So one would be that it's an interoperability mandate would not be something that, let's say, just secures data privacy or just protects IP, but it's actually a combination, an amalgamation of both of them, and therefore putting them under a specific legislation as a set of rules might be not that like it might be much better to sort of have it as a standalone law with both sort of considerations at the same place factored in. The other thing would be that if you formulate it in a set of rules, it would delegate a lot of power to the executive. And in my opinion, personally, it would be in the context, we've already seen the debates about the personal data bill, etc., etc. Therefore, in that context, I feel that if you have it as a separate legislation, it can be debated upon in the parliament whenever it's being introduced. And a lot of these concerns that I mentioned here can also be debated upon when the law is being implemented, rather than just a government agency bringing it into force. So I would say like a separate law. So in the US, we've had some initiatives like the Augmenting Compatibility Act. So it's called the Access Act of 2021, which has similar requirements of interoperability, of real-time portability and interoperability. And so that has been a separate law introduced in the US. It's yet to be implemented as a law, but I feel like something along those lines could perhaps be introduced in India as well.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Karthik. That was really, like I said, a really excellent explainer of everything that's been going down in this sector. If you'd like to watch this video again, or if you'd like to watch any of the other scholars, please feel free to head over to our YouTube channel or to our website, which is MediaNama.com. And do reach out to Karthik if you'd like to connect more over this research as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aarti. And thank you for everyone for logging in and going through my presentation. I hope it made sense. And yeah, thank you again.